By 2012, Nvidia had finally learned their lesson. No more would Nvidia be launching massive GPUs on new processes. And AMD had again launched first with their 7970 GPU. That one launched at the end of December 2011, and I for one was not that impressed with its performance, and neither were Nvidia. Now for months we waited on the GTX 660 arriving, as we knew that Nvidia was launching their mid-range first. And we waited a month, 1 or 2 leaks came in, and the leaks were suggesting that the GTX 660 was actually faster than AMD's 7970. And then a few weeks later we heard that the GTX 670 was faster than AMD's 7970. But then finally, at the end of March in 2012, Nvidia launched their GTX 680 and retook the performance crown. They had launched the graphics card, the GTX 680, with a GPU codenamed GK104. A much smaller 294 square millimeters with only 3.5 billion transistors. A very small increase over the GTX 580. The reason that it still had an increase was down to the new 28nm process, and the GTX 680 only had a 28.8% lead over the GTX 580, less than 40% ahead of the broken GTX 480. Now to anyone who has followed this video so far, it should be clear that this is unacceptable. Nvidia has launched their mid-range GPU using their high-end branding, the GTX 680, the same as the 580, the 480, the 280, even going all the way back to the 6800 Ultra. When you think about 8 with Nvidia, you think high-end. But this was clearly not Nvidia's high-end GPU. We knew they were releasing mid-range first. And over at Anantech's conclusion, the GTX 680 was by far the easiest recommendation they've been able to make for an Nvidia flagship video card. Over at Tech Power Up, GTX 680 comes in 28% ahead of the GTX 580 and 7.5% faster than the HD 7970. In fact, in the Tech Power Up conclusion, they say it's 16% performance increase over the GTX 580, and this apparently is a thumbs up. 16% performance increase, flagship to flagship, while being reasonably priced at $500? And over at Tom's, another glowing recommendation. Now, going back to Anantech again, looking at the bigger picture, Ryan points out that ultimately we still haven't moved very far on the price performance curve compared to where we've gone in past generations, and that is one of the smaller generational jumps we've seen for a GTX X80 product. But they're still talking about Nvidia's conservative pricing at $500, and yes, that would be true for an Nvidia flagship. Pricing would be conservative, but this was not an Nvidia flagship, was it? It was Nvidia's mid-range graphics card. Nvidia's previous mid-range graphics card cost $250, just over a year previous to this. So why was this mid-range GPU, badged as high-end, suddenly conservative at $500? And the thing here is, Ryan does know the score. He knows more about GPUs than I do, and he said, based on GK104's die size, he's left wondering where the GTX 680 is going to be sitting at the end of the year. What happened here was simple. AMD launched a brand new architecture, GCN, and when you launch a new architecture, the drivers are invariably in a poor state. And over this year and the following years, the 7970 became easily the faster graphics card of the two. The 680 launched at 10% faster, but it wasn't long before the 7970 or the later rebrands were actually a lot faster. And the reason for that was the GTX 680 was a mid-range graphics card, only had 2GB of RAM versus 3GB on the 7970, and it also lacked the bandwidth. And all these guys knew it. They knew that this was not Nvidia's flagship, and yet it launched with the flagship name and a slightly below flagship price to universal acclaim. You see, the problem with Nvidia is, if you don't heavily criticise them, then they simply see their actions as legitimate, and if you give them an inch, they will happily take a mile. And the year after, still with the GK, the Kepler architecture, the same architecture as the GTX 680, they launched their GTX Titan, finally giving us the big Kepler GK110, another massive GPU at 561 square millimeters and just over 7 billion transistors, double the size basically as the GTX 680. And the reason for that was it was pretty close to being twice the size of the GPU, but this was not the full GK110, and in fact the GTX Titan launched as a cut down GK110 at $1,000. Nvidia had finally achieved their goal of the $1,000 GPU, and they didn't even give you the full version. One of the more amusing things about this was, back when Nvidia launched their previous flagship, their true flagship that is, the GTX 580, Chris Angelini over at Tom's Hardware said, "You don't design a GPU with 512 shader cores, ship a a flagship board based on that chip with some of them turned off and then say, yeah, we meant to do that. That's exactly what Nvidia did with the GTX Titan. Had a few more shader cores of course, but they launched a flagship graphics card with a cut down GPU and a $1,000 price tag, and only 33% faster than the GTX 680. You can be sure that this card got slammed in the press, right? In actual fact, the press loved it. It had a decent cooling solution on it, and Nvidia said, look, this is not really a gaming card, it's a compute card. And most in the press were happy to go along with that. So the Titan at $1,000 and cut down GPU was given legitimacy. I can't help but wonder what Anand and Derek would have said about it though. But it's like I said about Nvidia, if you give them that legitimacy, then they will just take even more the next time. And that's exactly what they did with the GTX 780. You remember the cut down CUDA cores on the GTX Titan? They chopped it even further for the GTX 780. The GTX 780 should have been the flagship Kepler, but Nvidia had cut it down so severely that it was only 20% faster than the GTX 680, which remember was only 29% faster than the GTX 580. But this was not like Fermi. This was not an engineering issue. This was a deliberate decision by Nvidia to give you less. And we know that is true because when AMD finally got their act together again and launched the Hawaii GPUs, which I talked about in my recent video, Something Wrong at Radeon, Nvidia had chopped down their GTX 780 so much, and their Titan, that AMD's much smaller GPU, their Hawaii GPU at only 440 square millimeters was actually faster than both. Nvidia's response, of course, was to finally give you the full GK110, the full true GPU, which should have been the GTX 680 1 year previously, and it was just fast enough to once again take over the high-end lead. And an interesting conclusion at AnandTech where Ryan says, after having seen Nvidia upstage themselves a couple of times this year already with GK110, it's admittedly getting a bit harder each time to write about Nvidia's flagship GPU. 11% faster than AMD's Hawaii 290X, only 9% faster than the Titan, and a full 20% faster than the original GTX 780 that it formally replaces. And at $700, it was by no means cheap. But at least it was cheaper than the $1,000 Titan, right? But the worst thing about the Kepler series was it died a terrible death. As we can see over at Gamers Nexus, who did a GTX 780 Ti in 2016 benchmark. Battlefield 1, there's an R9 390X, which was a faster R9 290X. Look at the difference in performance, 88 frames per second against 58. Now remember, this 780 Ti was around 10% faster than the R9 290X. And here again we see in Call of Duty Black Ops 3, 140 frames per second for the 390X, 89.7 for the 780 Ti. You just imagine where the Titan and the GTX 780 are on these charts. Nvidia simply milked the Kepler architecture for all of its worth. Even cards like the GTX Titan Black, 780 Ti with more memory and another Titan name, and by and large, they got away with it. Now, given the fairly warm reception for really what was a pretty mediocre architecture in Kepler, you can probably imagine the kind of reception something that was actually good would get. And in 2014, good is what we got. In actual fact, I would go as far as saying great. With the GeForce 9 series, Nvidia had skipped over 8 and gone straight from 7 to 9, which is something I find very dubious. Even more dubious, they once again launched their flagship GTX 980 graphics card with a GPU of size 398 square millimeters, which is definitely on the high end of mid-range, only had 5.2 billion transistors. If you remember, the big Kepler, GK110, it had over 7 billion transistors. Now this is still in TSMC's 28nm, but the die size was down and the number of transistors was down. But this was a brand new architecture and a brand new chip called GM204, and that's how I know it's a mid-range GPU because it ends in 4. The same as the GTX 680 with GK104, we now had the GeForce GTX 980. And a price point of $550. That's another $50 on your mid-range. Now, the performance advantage over the 780 Ti was only 5%. Going by Tech Power Up's numbers, 5% over the Ti and 29% over the 780. So you may say, well, why not compare it against the 780? That would be the true generational upgrade. And if you are thinking that, then I would simply just answer with, it's still only a 29% upgrade in performance. And not only did they skip one generation, as far as the branding goes, they've skipped 2 generations, not 1. But suddenly the order of the day was now performance per watt. Maxwell is a great architecture, one of the top 5 GPU architectures ever, and by far and away the best of recent times. Absolutely nobody would argue with that. But once again, Nvidia's flagship consumer card was powered by a smaller and more potent consumer class X04 GPU, and the press absolutely loved it. I loved the 980 as well. It was just massively overpriced because it's a great mid-range graphics card. It is not a high-end graphics card. A 5% increase over the previous generational flagship would never have been acceptable in Annan's time. 6 months later, the new Titan, the GTX Titan X. This time the real high-end graphics chip, GM200, and also at this time, the biggest GPU ever seen at 601 square millimeters and 8 billion transistors. Still of course on TSMC's 28 nanometers. Now, you may wonder what this massive die size was all about, as Nvidia had of course been showing signs of dropping die sizes, but this one's pretty easy to explain. We had been stuck on 28 nanometers for a very long time, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, launching with a very large chip on a brand new process doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a very difficult thing to pull off, and as we saw with Fermi, it can go badly wrong. But the reverse of this is also true. The longer you stay on a node, the more yields mature, basically as the process just gets better and better over time. So this allows for larger GPUs to be launched. There's still a limit to how many GPUs you can get on a wafer, but 3 years after a process launches, the yields would be much higher. And as we saw with the 980 GM204, it was quite a bit larger than GK104. Simply put, because it was 28 nanometers, they did have to increase the die size in order to get that bit more performance. And this is almost certainly what Nvidia will do with their upcoming Volta architecture. Another reason why it makes sense is that over time, the cost of the wafer drops as well. So a 28 nanometer wafer 3 or 4 years after 28 nanometer launched could even be around half the cost. So even though the GPUs are larger, Nvidia still made more money. And in the case of the Maxwell Titan X, they really made more money with another $1,000 launch price. Unlike the previous Kepler Titan though, this was indeed the full die. Again, this was down to the process maturity, but there was also another reason for that. Having seen how close AMD got with Hawaii, the R9 290X, Nvidia must have been worried about what AMD would do next with their own upcoming GPU, Fiji, better known as Fury X. And once again, over at Tech Power Up we can see the GTX Titan X was 29.8% faster than the GTX 980. Another flagship 6 months later, and another 30%. And this time Nvidia hadn't bothered with the pretense of it being a compute card, because it wasn't. The reason Maxwell was so fast at graphics was that most of the compute was stripped out of it. Everything else about the Titan remained though, that being the large die size, the mediocre increase in performance, and of course, the $1,000 price point. At $1,000, AMD's Fury X would have looked like a very good buy compared to that, but it was clear that Nvidia could simply chop down GM200, increase the clock speeds a bit, and get very similar performance at a much cheaper price. And that's exactly what the GTX 980 Ti was, only 4% slower than the Titan X at $650. And it's pretty interesting to look at what happened today. We don't have the Titan X here unfortunately, but looking at that chart, we can see now that the Fury X is probably tied with the old Maxwell Titan, slightly ahead of the 980 Ti, while being a little bit further ahead at 4K. What I've basically called the best architecture of recent times, AMD got very close to it. But these are stock cards, and Maxwell of course had one massive advantage over the competition, and that was its overclockability. And that's something that is about to be very relevant when I take a look at the final architecture and the final series in this video. And of course I'm talking about Pascal. And the GTX 1080 launched with GP104, a die size of 314 square millimeters and 7.2 billion transistors on TSMC's new 16 nanometer process. So once again, the X80 branding with a mid-range GPU. And every time I say that the GTX 1080 is a mid-range graphics card, people get upset. Yet its die size at 314 square millimeters is squarely in the mid-range. The codename of GP104 quite clearly tells us it's a mid-range GPU. We know that there's bigger GPUs coming, and in fact before GP104 launched, Nvidia had already launched their massive GP100, costing what was it, $10,000 or so? Not for gamers obviously. Gamers only ever got that when there was competition. But this was clearly a mid-range GPU, so what made people think it was high-end? Was it the performance that did it? Well, over at Tech Power Up we can see it's around 30% faster than the Titan X. So I guess by today today's standards, where we got used to 10, 20, 5% increase in performance, today it probably does look like a good increase. And compared to the GTX 980, there's an increase of 66%. But there was actually a better step up between the GTX 680 and the GTX 980. And as we already saw, both of those were, of course, mid-range GPUs as well. And Ryan is now quite clear to point this out, that the GTX 980 Ti and Titan X owners can also hold back, as the card isn't GM200's replacement. So this isn't meant to be replacing the big Titan. I'm sure it's 30% faster, but we know that there's something bigger and faster coming for people in that market segment. And when I did my review of this card, the question I asked people was, who's going to buy this graphics card? The Founders Edition had pushed the price up to $700. $700 for a mid-range graphics card. I mean, GTX 980 owners only paid $550 about a year earlier. They're not going to spend $700 on this, surely. Or did they? Well, I don't know exactly who bought this card, but millions did, at $700 for a mid-range graphics card. And Nvidia proved it yet again that it was mid-range. And this time Nvidia didn't even wait 6 months. In fact, they barely waited 3 months before launching their true high-end, or I should say their true high-end for gamers graphics card, the Titan X Pascal. So what's that? 27% faster than the GTX 1080 at an eye-watering $1,200 price tag. GP102 at a much smaller 471 square millimeters and 12 billion transistors. And again, of course, it was the cut down version. At $1,200, Nvidia couldn't even give you the full GPU, just like with the original Titan. And the reason for that was they had planned, of course, on releasing something else, which would be the GTX 1080 Ti some 6 months later, which was even more cut down than the Titan X. But that allowed Nvidia to improve the clock speeds and claim that it was faster. Barely a week later, they launched the new Titan X-P. Once again, the world's fastest graphics card, and this time you did get the full GP102. And even Jay had had enough of this by now, as Nvidia is simply taking the piss. Let me just clarify this mid-range point. Nvidia launched GP100, they then launched GP104, after that they launched GP106, and then they launched GP102, and then they launched GP107. That is 5 GPUs, and GP104 is the middle one. That's the GTX 1080, the GTX 1070. It could not be any clearer that this is a mid-range GPU. So why did you pay more than high-end prices for it? The performance? 30% faster. It wasn't really 30% faster though, was it? Because remember that thing that made Maxwell special? I mean, Fury X is basically tied with the older Titan X, the Maxwell Titan X. But Maxwell had that overclock ability, didn't it? And one question I get asked a lot is, how did you nail the GTX 1080 so well? Some of my older videos, my Pascal versus Polaris stuff, I completely nailed Nvidia's Pascal series. I got the price right, I got the die size right, I got the performance almost spot on. Between 25 and 30% I said, the GTX 1080 will come in that much faster than the 980 Ti and the Maxwell Titan X. And I think I said it would cost $650. How did I know that this card would be 25-30% faster? It's a much smaller GPU. Okay, TSMC's new 16nm process came in there, and that allowed for much higher clock speeds. But back then when I was analysing it, I had no idea about that. But the answer to all this is, it wasn't really 30% faster, and it wasn't really 60-odd% faster than the GTX 980, because they of course compared it to the reference GTX 980 and the reference Titan X. If you stick a decent cooler on top of both of those GPUs, they will hit 1.4, 1.5 GHz, which is way higher than the crappy reference stuff. If you overclock the GTX 1080 to its maximum, and then you overclock the GTX 980 Ti or the old Titan X Maxwell, overclock them to the limits, and you're looking at closer to 15% faster. Nvidia just played an absolute blinder here. They could easily have launched a much faster GTX 980 and a much faster Titan X. At least 10% on both cards. But had they done that, then they would not have been able to get that 30% faster performance with the GTX 1080. And that is why I knew that the GTX 1080 would be that much faster, because they'd push it as far as they could go in order to make it faster. You remember that old roadmap that Nvidia showed where they didn't even have Pascal on it? They just went straight from Maxwell to Volta, and then afterwards we saw one where they had squeezed Pascal in there. They hadn't intended to do this with Pascal. They simply realised that they were sitting on a gold mine with Maxwell. That's why Pascal is Maxwell on speed. I mean, look, that's no bad thing. In technical terms, these are wonderful GPUs. You're just paying through the nose for them. It's a combination of marketing, and over time we simply accepted less until it became the norm. They say a picture paints 1,000 words, and this one paints a picture of the PC master race, surrendering performance and paying more for it. I mean, forget all about those 120, 130% increases. You're never getting them again. But the sad thing is, what was the norm back then? 60, 70, 80%? You're never getting that again. And those generational increases weren't even enough for guys like Anand and Derek Wilson. They wanted more. Only when they got more were they satisfied. Even sadder, you're not going to get 50%. You're not even going to get 40%, and you'll be lucky to see 30% again. As we just discussed right at the end there, performance is not actually on the up. That was a manufactured increase by Nvidia giving you slower Maxwell cards than they really had to. And this is the massive problem we have now, because Nvidia only ever gave you their best when they were under pressure and when they had competition. You look at a card like the GTX 480 and the GTX 580. I mean, those get pilloried, and we laugh about Fermi's power draw. But the sad fact is, Fermi was the last time that Nvidia actually tried. That was the last time Nvidia gave you their best. Since then, they've simply gave you what they think you'll take. And the way they've moved their high-end X80s into the mid-range while making you think that they stayed high-end, it's just sheer genius. People still recognise the X80s as being high-end, but they're clearly not. These are clearly mid-range GPUs now, yet you pay even higher than high-end prices. And this is what has basically caused Nvidia's massive lead. Now, you might think it's fair to say, well, this is what they deserve because AMD isn't competing very well. But we know the reason for that. Competition requires money, and it's money that they never got. Nvidia makes massive amounts of money now. Look at the money they're making. Ever since Pascal launched, you think they're going to give that money up again, ever? The only way it's possible to make that kind of money in graphics cards is by giving you the least they can at the highest possible price. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they are really making hay. Look at a card like the GTX 1070, chopped down by what, 25% again? The exact same thing they did with the GTX 260. Way back when they thought that AMD couldn't compete. You saw what happened there. AMD could compete, and Nvidia hastily rushed out a faster GTX 260, which to be fair, still barely competed. They didn't do that with the GTX 1070 because they knew they had no competition. People say to me, I don't care about this, I simply want the best, which just infuriates me because you're not getting the best. You've not had Nvidia's best since Fermi, and you'll never get their best ever again. And then there's the people who say stuff like, I hope AMD can compete so that it drives Nvidia's prices down. This just makes me want to facepalm. AMD cannot continue making graphics cards with that kind of mentality. They're not there to drive prices down, and they no longer do that. In case you didn't notice, AMD no longer even tries to compete like that now. Prices are high. AMD's prices are actually too high. It makes their cards extremely hard to recommend. But they've realised that the vast majority of people are going to buy Nvidia, so they may as well just scalp their own fanboys. The only people still buying AMD graphics cards, I assume, pretty much AMD fans. 10 years ago, we had some of the best competition ever, but the dumb fanboys were too desperate to declare a winner. And the only certainty here was, as soon as one of these companies won, which was always going to be Nvidia by the way, AMD had no chance. Nvidia's mindshare is just way too strong. But as soon as Nvidia won, the only possible outcome here was, you lost. And there are people out there, absolute idiots, who would like to see AMD die, just to be finished off as a company. You see them on forums all the time. They're pretty much desperate to show all of AMD's bad news, gloating over Vega's mediocre performance. But when I look at Vega, I simply see a very good compute card. AMD will make more money on Vega than they did with any other GPU in their history. Apple seem pretty keen on it, and they've just signed a deal with Baidu. That could be worth a fortune over time, so there's no danger here to AMD dying. The only thing that's happened here is gamers have lost out. Nvidia now interested in mining. Miners want performance per watt. They'll get the better cards compared to gamers because they're prepared to pay more. Gamers will get less and less. And AMD's doing the right thing, because the PC master race has decided that all they want is Nvidia, and every year you'll get less while paying more. I don't expect consumers to know about all this stuff, but I do feel that the press needs to do more. We need to get back to the days of Anand and Derek Wilson. We need to start being critical of these mediocre increases. 30% was never acceptable until recently, but we made it acceptable, and now it's the norm. And here's the problem here. All the new gamers coming into the gaming industry, they actually believe that these cards like the GTX 1080, they clearly believe that card's worth it. And if we were happy to legitimise a maximum of 30% performance increase, you can be sure of something. Nvidia will do their very best to make 15% look reasonable, and then 10%, and then 5%, and it's basically everything that Intel did without the competition being there. You need to forget about AMD, you need to look at what Nvidia is doing. That's what matters here, not how badly AMD is performing. What matters is what Nvidia gives you every time AMD is nowhere near, because as far as I'm concerned, AMD graphics will not be be coming back to the high end. Right, to sum this one up, I hope you enjoyed it. It's been an incredibly long and involved process, and I am never doing this again. Don't bother asking for the AMD version of this one, guys. There is no chance. You couldn't pay me enough money. Not for all the tea in China would I do that. But it's pretty clear I'm on a downer on the graphics market, and I hope you understand why that is. And sadly, there's nothing we can do about it. It's too late now. But maybe talk about that in a future video. But I'll be taking a little break from this level of analysis and look out for 1 or 2 build videos, and before too long, maybe even a review or 2. I'll catch you later, guys.